second call for assistance is that we shall all constitute here in our groups and in our organized bodies and in our individual dedications educational cadres against the tremendous handicap that we face momentarily in the political and economic climate of the nation. All ideas of this scope and with these goals, the goal of helping the poor, of realizing for the depressed segments of our country the dream of the fathers, at this moment we face reaction. I don't think in this company, which is made up of realists in the civil rights movement, in the political movement, in the religious movement, I do not have to underscore the fact that at this moment of October 1966, we are confronted with the possibility that not conservatism, but reaction may gain additional ground in the November elections and may color the political atmosphere opening in January. I ask you, therefore, not to bemoan this or to, in some Don Quixote fashion, to imagine that you can sally forth against it on a frontal attack. But I ask you to maintain your faith and your dedication and your works in the face of this possible climate of opinion, and that you would go. I ask you to back it up with a consistent, unaided educational program in support of these particular goals, yes, but in support of our belief, the belief of the people on our side, that this is what this country was created for. Thank you.
Mr. Rustin, Mr. Randolph, and friends, we have been talking about the reasons for the freedom budget. I thought it might be helpful in answer to this question if I summarize briefly not the reasons for the freedom budget, but what is in the freedom budget. This may be helpful to all of you here, including the working press, although I know in due course you will examine it more in detail. Now, first of all, it has been said that the freedom budget is not for Negroes but for all Americans. This is true. It has not been equally emphasized today that the freedom budget is not just a war against poverty, because in our great cities, their present condition is truly a dagger in the hearts of the poor, but the present condition of our cities is also a thorn in the flesh of everybody who lives in them, and will remain so unless the time comes. But there's an immensely more important question than this, because that new revolution is directed only toward whether an economy which is strong and powerful is important than that. Because instead of shifting from looking at the federal budget to looking at the national economy, it shifts from looking to the national economy to looking at the American people. And it asks the question, not is the economy going a little slower or a little faster, or are we going to have a little recession a year from now or 2 years from now? These relatively unimportant questions that are dazzling the commentators and the financiers and the analysts and the columnists. It asks who's on the train. It asks who is sharing in this great and dazzling wealth. It asks where do we want to go? And looking at the American people rather than at the American economy, it says, what are our priorities What do we want to use this great instrument for? And it therefore it reduces, as has been said, the market from quantities. The current discussion of the tax problem shows that there is absolutely no moral content in the public discussion of this question, because the real question is not whether in fact the pressure of our resources against our economic growth potentials calls for an increase in taxes. It's a different kind of question. Everybody who is not against the war in Vietnam, and if they're against the war in Vietnam, that's in a different geometry. The thing is that it seems to me that if we marshal fully our economic resources, there is probably enough growth potential in the American economy to cover these costs without increasing taxes, that we should unblushingly say certain question shows the infantile manner in which we have approached the problem of poverty. You can set up a special agency to catch speeders on the road because this is a very limited job. You set up a traffic department. You don't set up a special agency to make war on poverty, because a war on poverty involves the whole fabric of the national performance. The war on poverty has got to be led by the President, the Congress, and the people through the whole congeries of national policies that deploy through all agencies. This is one of the troubles with the Office of Economic Opportunity. The war on poverty is tax policy and money policy and social security policy and housing policies and all the policies. Now, sure, when you have a war like World War II, you don't set up a special agency to fight that war. You fight it through your institutions. You may set up a special planning, coordinating body somewhere, and I think that probably would be needed in the case of a war against poverty. But this isn't a matter of creating an agency. This is a matter of awakening a national conscience. We've created... What? Who's taking care of the war in Vietnam? The President, the Congress, and the people through their departments of government and through their institutions. And the reason we're taking care of that is because we think it's important. Now, when we think... What's that? Well, you see, without criticizing you in any way, young lady, you have been bedazzled by some of the current war. You may think that the way to help old people to get more income is to set up a bedlam of thousands of committees all over the country, debating whether the poor shall lead the blind or the blind shall lead the poor, and debating whether a particular committee shall be appointed by Mr. Powell or Mr. Shriver or by the mayor. I say that the way to get more money to the old people, who constitute 1/5 of all of our poor, is to take a system that has been in effect since 1935. The envelopes are all addressed, the names are all on them. All you have to do is put bigger checks in the envelopes, and you do that through legislation which bespeaks the national conference. And you wouldn't need a bedlam of committees, and you wouldn't need to be making a political shenanigans out of it. and you wouldn't have the labor groups and Mr. Shriver at war with each other. You'd be taking a straight down the line approach to that phase of it. Now you come to housing. We put a tremendous effort, a tremendous liberal effort, into creating a new department. Well, I think I know as much about housing as anybody in that department. The head of it worked for me, and I was in it for 9 years, and I wrote a lot of the legislation. We had a great fight, and we got a new department. But are we rebudgeting the housing programs to the needs of the country? Again, we're thinking in terms of labels. We're thinking in terms of cabinet dignity. Now, that's an answer to the question, are we going to have some agency which we regard as our personal possession that we can look at and say, this is the agency that is going to make us no longer poor? No. We're going to be no longer poor when we have a war against poverty. And we'll have a war against poverty with all its implements when the President and the Congress and the people and our private institutions, as they are affected by legislation, change their course and do things they're not doing now. And the first thing you need is a budget telling us what we need to do. And just the problem of inscribing new...
Thank you, Mr. Rustin. Distinguished friends and fellow citizens, brothers and sisters, let me express my deep appreciation to you for joining me today in the launching of the Freedom Budget for all Americans. Many of you have come long distances to be here, and not for the first time. For I see in this audience the faces of many men and women, black and white, who came together 3 years ago to realize another great dream, the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. In a very real sense, we have gathered today to undertake the redemption and the completion of the goals set forth on that historic day in August of 1963. Since that day, much has changed. There are signs of new resistance to our struggle. We face more complex and difficult problems. Weary but no less cruel indifference has settled upon elements in the Congress, and within our own ranks, confusion and division have been exploited by our enemies. But I believe and profoundly hope Negroes, of course, are no strangers to poverty. 2/3 of our families have an annual income of $4,000 or less. This at a time when the latest studies show that an urban family of 4 requires $6,800 a year for a modest but adequate standard of living. But while most Negroes live in poverty and deprivation, it is not true that most of the poor and deprived are Negroes. We must not forget that 75% of the poor are whites. No less than Negroes are they denied adequate income, decent housing, quality education, sufficient health care, and security. The tragedy is that the workings of our economy so often pit the white poor and the black poor against each other at the bottom of society. The tragedy is that groups only one generation removed from poverty themselves, haunted by the memory of scarcity and fearful of slipping back, step on the fingers of those struggling up the ladder. And the tragedy is that are not only the poor, but disintegration. The Freedom Budget demonstrates that the abolition of poverty, its causes and symptoms, is not only morally right, but economically imperative. It demonstrates that we can achieve full employment and full production if we will meet our unmet social needs, if we will clear the slums and rebuild our cities, if we will provide the schools and hospitals we need, if we will purify our air and water, if we will bring our transportation systems and natural resources development into line with our needs. We cannot achieve these goals through haphazard, piecemeal efforts. We cannot solve the problems of the schools while leaving the slums intact. We cannot train people for jobs when there are no jobs. And so, brothers and sisters, what we need is an overall plan of attack, a coordinated mobilization of our natural resources. We need, in short, not a skirmish, not a battle, but a real war on poverty. This is what the freedom budget is. It is not visionary or utopian. It is feasible. It is concrete. It is specific. It is quantitative. It talks dollars and cents. It sets goals and priorities. It tells how these can be achieved. And it places the responsibility for leadership with the federal government, which alone has the resources equal to the task. The question is not whether we have the means. Before 1975, we will have a $1 trillion economy. The question is whether we have the will. 10 years from now, will 2/5 of our nation still live in poverty and deprivation? This is above all a moral question, and upon the answer hangs not only the fate of the Negro, weighted down by centuries of exploitation, degradation, and malice, but the fate of the nation. Brothers and sisters, from all that I have said, it is clear that the implementation of the freedom budget cannot be won by the Negro alone. The abolition of poverty requires allies welded into a massive national coalition. It requires a unified movement representing the broadest cross-section
version question the need for one portion or another, but they are not likely to make a frontal assault on the full scope of its praiseworthy objectives. Sought to raise wages during the depths of the Depression.
I do not have to tell those in this room that in this historic church, and I think it's